I'm Lauren Bennett, 29 years old, and for most of my life, my mother's opinion of me has been measured in notes and scales. I had spent years believing I'd left that world behind. But one evening at a formal family dinner, she smiled across the table and announced that I would be playing piano at my sister's wedding. She said it like it was settled. No question, no escape. And in that moment, I felt the same knot in my stomach I used to get before every childhood competition. By the time dessert was served, I already knew this wasn't just about music. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever been handed a family duty you couldn't refuse no matter how much it cost you. I grew up in a quiet suburb outside Richmond, Virginia, in a house where appearances mattered more than comfort and achievement was a family currency. My mother, Margaret, had been a promising pianist before she married my father and settled down. When she discovered that I could find middle C without being shown twice, she decided I would live the dream she had been forced to leave behind. By the time I was 6, I could play pieces adults struggled to learn, and by 8, practice sessions had taken over my afternoons, weekends, and even holidays. Margaret stood over me with a stopwatch and a ruler, correcting posture and tempo until my shoulders ached. Caroline, my older sister by 3 years, didn't share my musical talent. Instead, she excelled at everything else, sports student government grades, and she did it all with the poise and polish my mother adored. She was the homecoming queen. I was the girl hunched over the piano in the corner of the living room. My father, Charles, traveled often for work, and when home avoided getting between us and our mother's expectations. His standard line, "Listen to your mother," became a quiet stamp of approval for whatever pressure she applied. At 16, after years of preparation, I stepped onto the stage of a national competition that was supposed to be my defining moment. Instead, under the glare of the lights and my mother's watchful gaze in the front row, my hand shook and the music slipped away. I stopped halfway through the piece, bowed stiffly, and walked off without finishing. The ride home was silent, until Margaret told me I'd wasted 12 years of her life. That night, I decided I would never play again. College gave me a way out. I majored in accounting, found a job at a mid-size firm, and kept my visits home brief. Caroline moved into an even brighter spotlight after graduating from an Ivy League school and joining a major marketing agency in the city. It was there she met Daniel Whitaker, heir to a family with a name that carried weight in the social pages. When they got engaged, the wedding planning became a full-scale production. My mother treated it as a society event, not just a family celebration, and every detail had to reflect well on the Bennetts. For months, the wedding dominated every conversation when I came home. I stayed on the edges, contributing little until that dinner, when Margaret decided my role. "Lauren will provide the music during cocktail hour," she said, as if I were part of the decor. Caroline glanced at me but said nothing. I managed a polite refusal, reminding her I hadn't performed in over a decade, but she leaned back with that knowing look, the one that said she could still push me into the mold she'd chosen. By the end of the night, I had agreed, not because I wanted to, but because saying no would have been another kind of defeat. I told myself it would be simple, that I could play a few easy pieces and slip out unnoticed. But deep down, I knew agreeing had opened a door I'd sworn shut years ago, and stepping through it might change far more than just a wedding playlist. The weeks after that dinner passed with the wedding growing closer, and the list of tasks for each family member becoming more detailed. Caroline was swept into fittings floral meetings and seating chart revisions, while my mother handled every other detail with a kind of relentless energy. My role was left untouched, except for a short email from her that arrived one Saturday morning. It was a single page labeled, Approved selections, a neat list of familiar, uncomplicated pieces, and a note at the bottom reminding me to keep it light and pleasant. I printed it and left it on the counter, telling myself I'd look at it later. That afternoon, I opened the closet in my spare bedroom and pulled out the digital piano that had been hidden under winter coats for years. It took some effort to move it into the living room, and for a moment I just stood looking at it, my hands resting on the smooth edge of the key's cover. When I finally lifted the lid and pressed down a key, the soft sound filled the quiet room. I started with scales, almost testing whether my fingers still knew what to do. They did, and soon I was playing short pieces from memory, then moving to more challenging ones I hadn't touched in over a decade. Hours passed without my noticing. The stiffness in my shoulders came back, but so did a faint thrill I hadn't felt in years. By the end of the weekend, I knew I couldn't go back to the lifeless selections my mother had chosen. They felt like background noise, and I wanted something with weight, something that told a story. I began working on an original piece, starting with a simple melody that had been in my mind for years. Each evening after work, I sat at the piano, adding layers, changing rhythms, and letting the music grow into something that felt entirely my own. About 2 weeks into this routine, I called Emma Crawford, a friend from my high school orchestra days, who had been the only one to understand how tangled my relationship with music and my mother had been. "You're playing at Caroline's wedding," she said when I told her. "After everything, that's bold." I explained my plan to play my own composition instead of my mother's approved list. There was a pause, then she laughed softly. "That's either the bravest or the most reckless thing I've heard in a while, but I think you should do it. Play for yourself this time." Her encouragement settled something inside me. It didn't make the nerves disappear, but it reminded me why I'd started writing the piece in the first place. This wasn't about defying my mother for the sake of it. It was about reclaiming the one part of my life she had claimed as her own. The days leading up to the wedding were filled with work at the firm by day and practice at night. I dreamed of frozen fingers and vanished keys, the same nightmares I used to have before competitions, but each morning I sat back down and played anyway. The night before the wedding, I stayed up later than I meant to, going through the piece from start to finish until it felt settled in my hands. I titled it Homecoming and printed a clean copy, though I'd memorized every note. The following morning, I arrived at Westbrook Manor, the sprawling estate my mother had chosen for the venue. It was early, but staff were already moving quickly between the ceremony garden, the reception hall, and the glass terrace where cocktail hour would be held. My mother met me at the entrance to the bridal suite, dressed in a champagne-colored gown, and already directing the wedding planner about the placement of the welcome table. "You're late," she said, though my watch showed I was early. She led me to the terrace and pointed to the far corner where a baby grand Steinway sat, partially hidden by a tall arrangement of roses and greenery. "You'll be right there," she said. "It's perfect. Music should be felt, not seen." I walked over and touched the keys, finding them smooth and responsive. The acoustics in the glass-walled room were better than I expected, the notes carrying warmly without echoing. As I played a few soft measures, a tall woman in an elegant navy dress approached. She listened for a moment, then smiled. "That's beautiful. Are you a professional?" she asked. I shook my head and told her I worked in accounting. She introduced herself as Linda Whitaker Daniels' mother and said she looked forward to hearing me later. Before I could answer, my mother appeared. "Linda, I see you've met Lauren. She'll be providing a bit of light music before dinner." Her tone made it sound like a minor detail rather than a performance. Linda's eyebrows lifted slightly, but she said nothing. After she left, my mother looked at me with a narrow gaze. "That wasn't from the list," she said. I told her it was just a warm-up, and she let it drop when the florist called her over to settle a question about the arch. With time to spare, I wandered back toward the bridal suite. The door was open, and I heard Caroline speaking to our father in a low voice. She was saying something about the guest list being filled with people she barely knew and wishing the day felt more like hers. My father's voice was quieter, saying that our mother saw the wedding as a reflection of herself. I hesitated, then knocked lightly on the frame. Caroline turned a little flustered. "Lauren, come in," she said. Our father excused himself, muttering about checking on the parking attendants. I told her she looked beautiful, which she did. Her dress was simple and graceful, her hair pinned in a way that framed her face softly. "Is everything set for you later?" she asked. I nodded and mentioned the piano's placement in the corner. She rolled her eyes. "Mom's idea. She doesn't want anyone distracted from their conversations." She paused, then said, "I wanted you to play during the ceremony, but she already had the quartet booked." I told her I hadn't known, and she shrugged. "You were always the one with the music in you," she said. Without thinking, I replied, "And you were always the perfect one." Instead of taking offense, she gave a short, rueful laugh. "Perfect. I've been chasing impossible standards my whole life." The air between us shifted in that moment. For years we had been cast in roles, hers enviable, mine overshadowed, but now I saw how similar our struggles had been. Before we could say more, the wedding coordinator stepped in to announce it was almost time for her to head to the garden. As I left, she called after me, "Play something beautiful, okay? Something real." I promised I would, and as I walked back toward the terrace, I caught sight of my mother adjusting a floral display. She told me the sound technician would keep my microphone low so I wouldn't overpower the room. Guests were beginning to arrive, the murmur of voices mixing with the clink of glassware. I sat down at the piano, the sheet music for Homecoming resting on the stand, and took a slow breath. In less than 2 hours, I would know exactly how much of myself I was willing to share. Guests began to drift onto the terrace as the late afternoon light spilled across the glass walls, catching the edges of the lake beyond. The waitstaff moved quietly among them, offering champagne flutes and small plates as conversations started to rise in scattered pockets. From my seat behind the piano, I could see my mother directing people toward the bar with a smile that never seemed to waver. I began with a gentle nocturne, something soft enough to blend into the background. Finger steady, I let the notes fall evenly, knowing no one was paying attention yet. A few guests glanced in my direction, offering polite smiles before turning back to their conversations. It was exactly the atmosphere my mother had planned music that filled the air without asking to be noticed. After the first few pieces, I shifted seamlessly into the opening bars of Homecoming. The melody began quietly, almost hesitant, the sound carrying just enough to reach the nearest tables. A couple standing by the window paused mid-sentence and turned toward the piano. I kept my eyes on the keys, letting the music grow naturally, adding depth to the harmonies, feeling the composition move from something simple into something fuller. As the piece unfolded, more heads began to turn. A man near the bar leaned against his chair, listening, while a small group moved closer, their conversations slowing. The second movement brought sharper rhythms, climbing arpeggios that rose and fell like a shifting tide. I could see the wedding coordinator glance toward the corner and speak to a waiter who slipped away in the direction of the main hall. By the time I reached the section that broke into dissonant fragments, the terrace had grown noticeably quieter. Glasses clinked less often, and the scattered hum of voices had softened to a murmur. My hands moved quickly across the keys, the sound swelling the energy in the room, shifting with it. I could feel the tension of the music pulling people in, reshaping the space in a way I hadn't expected. From the edge of my vision, I caught sight of my mother entering, her expression tightening as she noticed the small crowd that had gathered near the piano. She stayed back, watching, her hands clasped lightly in front of her, as if weighing whether to step forward. I turned my attention back to the final pages of the piece, where the music rebuilt itself, the earlier melody returning, but stronger, more certain. The last chord lingered in the air for a breath before the applause began. It started from a single table, then spread until the whole terrace was clapping. I stood briefly, acknowledging them with a nod, and then sat again as a few guests stepped closer, offering quiet compliments. Among them was Linda Whitaker, her eyes bright. "That was extraordinary," she said. "I hope that's not all you're playing today." Before I could respond, Caroline appeared at her side, still in her gown, her veil tucked over one shoulder. She reached for my hand. "You just made my wedding day," she whispered. "That was the most real thing that's happened here." I told her I was glad she liked it, and she laughed softly. "Liked it. I want you to play again before dinner." Daniel joined us, glancing toward his mother. "I think that's a great idea," he said. Linda nodded in agreement. "The quartet can wait a bit," she added. "This is worth hearing again." Caroline turned to our mother, who had come closer, but kept her smile fixed. "Mom, let's have Lauren play during the first course," she suggested. There was a pause before she answered, her tone carefully neutral. "If that's what you'd like, dear." With that settled, the staff moved the piano to a more central position in the reception hall. The quartet, gracious and unbothered, agreed to adjust their set. As guests found their seats, I sat back down at the keys, the murmur of the room feeling different now, less scripted, more open. I began the piece again, letting it fill the larger space, the sound reaching every table. From where I sat, I could see my father at a table near the front, watching closely, his expression unreadable but focused entirely on me. Caroline leaned toward Daniel, smiling, as she tapped her fingers lightly in time with the music. Even my mother, standing by the far wall, seemed momentarily still. The final measures brought another warm wave of applause, followed by a few people asking for my name and whether I performed publicly. I thanked them, slipping the business cards they offered into the small clutch on the piano bench. The meal carried on, but the energy between us all had shifted. My mother kept her distance, speaking with guests, but glancing toward me now and then. When dessert arrived and the dancing began, I stayed near the edge of the room, the evening moving forward without the sharp weight I had expected to carry all night. It wasn't until later, when most guests had moved to the dance floor, that my mother approached. She didn't raise her voice, but her words were direct. "That was not what we discussed." I met her gaze without answering, the music still echoing in my mind. She shook her head slightly, scanning the room before stepping back. "We'll talk later," she said, and walked away, leaving the words between us like a stone waiting to be moved. The reception hall had grown quieter after the first round of dancing, the music from the band fading into a slower rhythm as more guests drifted to their tables. I stayed near the piano, unsure if my mother would approach again, but she remained across the room, speaking with a cluster of relatives. Caroline passed by on her way to the dessert table, pausing to rest her hand on my shoulder. "I've never seen them this interested in anything outside the dance floor," she said, nodding toward the table where a group of guests were still discussing my performance. When the last course had been cleared, I gathered my sheet music ready to step away for the evening. Before I could, Linda Whitaker appeared with Daniel at her side. "You truly have a gift," she said, her voice carrying the kind of sincerity that doesn't need embellishment. "Have you ever thought about performing outside of family events?" I hesitated, explaining that I worked full-time in accounting. Daniel smiled. "That doesn't mean you can't make room for this," he said, gesturing toward the piano. As they moved on to greet other guests, I noticed my father approaching from the opposite side of the room. He took his time crossing the floor, stopping once to exchange a few words with an old friend before reaching me. "I should have said something earlier," he began. "You played beautifully today." It was simple, but there was a weight behind it that I hadn't heard from him in years. The evening wound down with the usual wedding traditions. The bouquet tossed the send-off with sparklers lining the walkway. Caroline and Daniel disappearing into the waiting car. I stayed back helping the staff collect stray programs and glasses from the tables. The band was packing up the last notes of the night, still humming faintly through the speakers. My mother passed by without looking in my direction, speaking to the coordinator about final payments. When most of the guests had left, I sat at the now quiet piano playing softly for myself. The room felt different without the crowd, the sound warmer and less contained. A member of the catering team walked over with a shy smile. "My sister took a video of you earlier," she said. It made her cry in a good way. "She told me to tell you it was beautiful." I thanked her, folding the moment away like a keepsake. Later in the parking lot, the air was cool against my face as I carried my music to the car. My father caught up to me before I could leave. "You know," he said, resting a hand on the door, "I should have stepped in more when you were younger. I let your mother handle things her way and I stayed out of it. That was easier for me, but it wasn't right for you." I met his eyes, hearing the sincerity in his voice. "It was hard feeling like I could never meet her standards," I said quietly. He nodded. "I was always proud of you, Lauren. I just didn't say it enough." The drive home was quiet, the streets nearly empty at that hour. My hands still carried the memory of the keys, the way the music had settled into the room and changed it. When I reached my apartment, I set my sheet music on the kitchen counter instead of tucking it away. It felt like a small decision, but one that mattered. The next few days returned to routine. I went back to the firm answering emails and reviewing reports, but each evening I found myself at the piano. The melody from Homecoming stayed with me, and I began to expand on it, adding new movements, testing different progressions. It wasn't about preparing for another performance. It was about seeing where the music could go, now that it was mine again. A week after the wedding, Caroline called from her honeymoon. I could hear the ocean behind her voice. "I'm still getting messages about your playing," she said. "Linda wants you to perform at an arts gala this fall." I smiled, leaning against the counter. "She's already emailed me twice," I told her. Caroline laughed. "You should do it. You were wasted behind that desk before." I said it wasn't that simple, though. Part of me wondered if it could be. Before she hung up, she added, "Mom hasn't said anything about it, but I can tell she's still thinking. Just give her time." The line clicked off, leaving me in the quiet of my kitchen. I looked toward the piano, the afternoon light catching the edge of its keys, and knew I wasn't ready to put it back in the closet. The following evening, I opened my laptop and drafted an email to my mother. I suggested we meet for lunch somewhere neutral. She replied within an hour, agreeing without hesitation. It was the first time in years we'd arranged to see each other without the buffer of a family event. As I closed my laptop, the music from earlier still echoing in my mind, I realized that whatever came next, the conversation ahead would be unlike any we'd had before. I arrived at the cafe a few minutes early, choosing a table near the window, where the midday sun softened the edges of the room. The clink of cutlery and low hum of conversation felt different from the formality of my parents' house. I set my bag on the chair beside me, rehearsing in my mind how I might begin. When my mother walked in, she looked smaller somehow, her usual brisk energy tempered by the simple surroundings. She offered a polite greeting and sat down, smoothing the napkin over her lap before we ordered. We made small talk about Caroline's honeymoon, the weather, and a neighbor who had recently moved away. When the drinks arrived, she hesitated before speaking. "Your father tells me you've been playing again," she said, watching my face carefully. I nodded. "Every day," I replied. She picked up her water glass, turning it slowly in her hands. "That piece you played at the wedding, you wrote it yourself." I told her yes, meeting her eyes. There was a flicker of something surprise maybe, before she said, "It was impressive." Not what I expected. Her words were measured, but they carried more weight than anything she'd said to me in years. I took a breath. "When you asked me to play, was it really just about saving money, or was it about reminding me of what happened before?" She set her glass down and folded her hands. "I don't know," she admitted after a pause. "Maybe both. Maybe neither. When you stopped playing, it felt like you were walking away from everything I'd tried to give you." "It wasn't about walking away from you," I said quietly. "It was about surviving. The pressure was too much." She didn't argue. Instead, she looked down at the tablecloth, tracing the edge with her finger. "I wanted you to succeed where I couldn't," she said. "I thought pushing you would make you stronger." Her voice softened. "I see now it might have done the opposite." We sat in silence for a moment, the words settling between us. I told her that music had stopped being mine somewhere along the way, that it had become about avoiding disappointment rather than creating something. She listened, her expression unreadable. And now she asked. "Now it's mine again," I answered. "I play because I want to, not because I have to." She nodded slowly. "I saw Linda yesterday," she said after a moment. "She couldn't stop talking about you, about how you should be performing." A trace of her familiar competitiveness slipped through as she added, "She asked if you had an agent." I smiled faintly. "I'm not looking for one," I said. "Right now I'm just finding my way back to it." The rest of the lunch was lighter. We talked about an old family friend's upcoming move and a recipe she wanted to try. When we stood to leave, there was no grand resolution, but something had shifted. It wasn't trust, not yet, but maybe the start of understanding. In the weeks after, I kept playing each evening. Some nights I returned to homecoming adding new phrases. Other nights I explored entirely different ideas. My sessions became less about practice and more about discovery. I began keeping a notebook on the piano bench, jotting down progressions and small fragments of melody. Midway through the month, an email from Linda arrived. She formally invited me to perform at the Arts Foundation Gala in the fall, offering a spot between the opening remarks and the auction. The message was gracious but enthusiastic, and it came with a note that she hoped this would be the first of many. I accepted, feeling a quiet sense of anticipation. Caroline called later that week. "That's wonderful news," she said when I told her. "You're going to have the room in the palm of your hand." I laughed, telling her I hadn't even decided what to play yet. "Whatever it is, it'll be perfect," she said. Then her voice softened. "You know, watching you at the wedding made me realize I don't have anything like that, something that's mine." Our conversations grew easier after that. We stopped circling each other with the polite distance we'd kept for years, and began sharing small pieces of our lives again. I told her about a student I'd started teaching in the evenings, a retired nurse named Helen, who had always wanted to learn piano. Caroline told me about an idea she had for a small business she'd never had the courage to try. The gala became a quiet goal in the background of my days. I balanced my work at the firm with teaching 2 evenings a week, finding satisfaction in helping others approach music without fear of mistakes. Each student brought a different story, and each reminded me of how personal and varied the connection to music could be. By late summer, my apartment was filled with the sound of rehearsals, the walls carrying the notes from one room to the next. My father stopped by one evening, bringing a box of my old music books he'd found in the attic. "Thought you might want these," he said, setting them on the table. Inside were pieces I hadn't seen in over a decade, their pages worn from years of use. I thanked him, and he stayed for a while listening as I played through a few of them. He didn't say much, but his presence in the room felt steady, unhurried. When he left, the music books remained on the table, a quiet reminder of both where I had been and where I was headed. As summer began to turn toward fall, I found myself thinking less about the distance between my mother and me, and more about the possibility of meeting her somewhere in the middle. The gala would bring us into the same room again, but this time I would be choosing what and how to play. The weeks between summer's end and the gala seemed to move quickly. My evenings filled with rehearsals, balancing the familiar pieces I had promised to play with the newer ones I was still shaping. The piano had become a constant presence, its open lid catching the light from the window in the late afternoons. Each practice felt different from the ones before, less like preparation for an obligation, and more like a conversation I was finally able to have on my own terms. When the night of the gala arrived, the city felt alive in a way it hadn't for weeks. The event was held in the ballroom of an old theater, the high ceilings draped in soft lighting that turned everything warm gold. Volunteers greeted guests at the entrance, their tables lined with programs and bidding paddles for the auction later in the evening. I was shown to the stage area where a polished grand piano waited under the lights, its surface reflecting the chandeliers above. Linda found me there dressed in a deep green gown that seemed to draw the color from her eyes. "I can't tell you how much everyone's looking forward to hearing you," she said, giving my hand a brief squeeze. "Take your time tonight. Let them hear who you are." Her words were simple, but they stayed with me as I checked the bench height and laid my music in place. The program began with speeches from the Foundation's board, followed by a short video highlighting the arts programs they supported. I waited in the wings, hearing my name announce the applause, carrying just enough to reach me. Walking out under the lights, I caught sight of familiar faces. Caroline smiling from a table near the front, my father seated beside her, and my mother, 2 seats over her posture, perfectly straight. I began with a familiar piece, something fluid and welcoming to ease both myself and the audience into the moment. The notes settled easily under my fingers, the sound filling the room without force. When it ended, there was a soft ripple of applause. I turned the page and began Homecoming. This time, I let the pauses breathe a little longer, the crescendos swell just a bit more. By the time I reached the final measures, the room had gone still. The applause was warmer longer this time, and I could see Linda at the back of the room nodding slightly, as if to say, "Yes, that's it." I returned to my seat at the table as the auction began, the rhythm of bidding and laughter filling the space where my music had been only minutes before. During the break before dessert, my mother stepped away from the table and came toward me. "You played well," she said, her tone clipped, but without the edge I'd grown used to. It suited the evening. It was not an outpouring, but it was something. I thanked her, letting the words stand as they were. Caroline joined us, looping her arm through mine. "You'll be back here next year," she said confidently, "maybe even before then." I smiled at her, the thought less daunting than it might have been months ago. After the gala, I continued to teach in the evenings, adding 2 more students to my schedule. The work was steady and satisfying, and with each lesson I found new ways to explain the things I had once done automatically. My father began stopping by more often, sometimes bringing groceries, sometimes just sitting quietly while I played. One evening in October, he arrived with a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a leather-bound notebook, the kind with pages that lay flat when opened. "For your compositions," he said simply. I placed it on the piano, running my hand over the cover before setting it aside for later. The weeks that followed brought a rhythm I hadn't expected, work at the firm lessons in the evenings, and my own playing filling whatever time remained. The distance between my mother and me was still there, but it no longer felt like an unbridgeable gap. We exchanged occasional emails, short and factual, but without the strain that used to sit in every word. As winter approached, an email from Linda arrived again. This time she invited me to play at a fundraiser in the spring, one that would be held outdoors if the weather allowed. I accepted without hesitation, noting the date on my calendar. The night after I replied, I sat at the piano with the leather-bound notebook open beside me. The pages were still blank, but the quiet of the apartment felt full of possibility. The next step was mine to choose. By early spring, the fundraiser Linda had mentioned was on my calendar, its date circled in blue ink. The venue was a sprawling botanical garden just outside the city, and she had described it as music under the stars if the weather cooperated. I kept my rehearsals steady, weaving the new pieces I'd been working on into my practice schedule. The leather-bound notebook from my father was now filled with sketches, fragments of melodies, chords I wanted to remember, and the beginnings of 2 longer compositions. When the evening arrived, the sky held on to its light longer than usual, the first hint of the season shifting. The stage was set on a wide lawn, framed by rows of blooming tulips with small clusters of tables scattered nearby for the guests. A portable grand piano gleamed under the canopy, its open lid catching the last of the sunlight. As I warmed up, the quiet around me was broken only by the shuffle of chairs and the clink of glasses from the refreshment tables. Caroline was one of the first to arrive, wearing a soft cream dress and carrying a small clutch. She made her way to the front, giving me a quick hug before finding a seat near the stage. My father joined her soon after, and the 2 of them spoke in low tones, occasionally glancing toward the walkway where guests were entering. My mother appeared just before the program began, her jacket neatly buttoned, her hair swept into an updo. She nodded at me as she passed, choosing a table a few rows back. Linda stepped onto the stage to welcome everyone, her voice carrying easily over the lawn. She spoke about the importance of the arts, the programs their fundraising supported, and then introduced me. The applause rose from all corners of the lawn, warm but expectant. I took my seat at the piano, the sheet music for my chosen pieces set in a neat row. I opened with something light, a piece meant to blend with the evening air. The sound carried cleanly soft at first, and then building as the melody unfolded. As I moved through the program, I could see the way the crowd leaned into the music conversations, quieting eyes turning toward the stage. Midway through, I began one of the new compositions from my notebook, still untitled but complete enough to stand on its own. The piece began with a slow, steady rhythm, gradually opening into broader harmonies. My hands moved with certainty, the music no longer feeling like something to be guarded, but something to be shared. In the middle section, the chords shifted into something more restless, a reflection of the years I'd kept this part of myself hidden. By the time the final notes faded, the sky above had deepened to a rich blue, the first stars beginning to appear. Applause rose again, and when I stood, I caught Caroline's smile and my father's nod. My mother was clapping, her expression unreadable in the dimming light. After the program, guests moved toward the refreshment tables, and several stopped to speak with me. Some asked about lessons, others about upcoming performances. Linda joined us, clearly pleased with the evening, and spoke about another event in the summer she wanted me to consider. As the crowd thinned, my mother approached. She looked around before speaking. "You've been busy," she said. I told her about the lessons, the notebook, and the new pieces. She listened without interrupting, then glanced at the piano. "You play differently now," she said. "It's not just technical." It wasn't phrased as a question, so I simply nodded. Caroline joined us then, linking her arm through mine. "We're going to dinner," she said, looking between us. "Come with us." My mother hesitated, then agreed, and we walked toward the parking lot together. It was the first time in a long while we'd left an event side by side. That night, at the small Italian restaurant near the garden, the conversation stayed easy about the tulips, the warm weather coming, and the way the stars had come out just in time for the last piece. My mother didn't mention the wedding, and I didn't bring it up. We left with plans loose but real to meet again before summer. The next morning, I sat at the piano with the notebook open, the blank page in front of me, waiting. The night before had felt like another quiet turning point. and I wanted to capture it before it slipped away. A few weeks after the fundraiser, I found myself back at the garden this time, without an audience or a program. The tulips had faded, replaced by rows of lilies swaying gently in the warm breeze. I'd brought my notebook, now almost full, and settled onto a bench with the sound of the fountain nearby. Caroline arrived a little later, carrying coffee for both of us. She sat beside me, scanning the pages I'd been working on. "You've written more in these past months than in years," she said. I nodded, thinking of the way the music had started flowing again once I'd let go of the need to protect it. My father joined us soon after, and the three of us talked easily, the kind of conversation that moves in and out of silence without effort. Even my mother had begun to find her way into these moments. The dinners weren't frequent, but they were no longer tense. She asked questions now, not just about schedules or obligations, but about the music itself. I kept my answers simple, letting the connection rebuild at its own pace. One evening, after a quiet meal at her house, she walked me to the door. "You were right to keep playing," she said, her voice low. I didn't see it then. It wasn't an apology in full, but it was something real, and I accepted it. The summer event Linda had mentioned was already taking shape, and she'd asked me to perform again. This time I said yes, without hesitation. There was no undercurrent of doubt, no fear of who might show up or who might stay away. On the night of the performance, as I played beneath the open sky, I could see familiar faces scattered through the crowd. Caroline, my father, Linda near the front, and even my mother sitting quietly in the back row. The music carried into the warm night air, and for once I wasn't measuring its worth by the applause. I've learned that not every relationship mends perfectly, and not every hurt fades completely. But small changes, a conversation an evening shared, a single gesture, can be enough to shift the path forward. If you've ever felt like something dear to you was overlooked or dismissed, I hope you'll keep it close until you're ready to share it again. You might be surprised by who listens.